I've shared many times how much I love numbers and gematria and formulaic numbers. And my kids, year after year, ask me about the numbers in the Torah. And many of you are members of our community ask me about this age and this number and that number. And actually, I often dismiss the ages in the Torah. And even though we say things, bis 120, may you live to 120, sometimes there are very specific benchmarks or milestones or indicators, especially with the way that things are phrased. For example, I spoke earlier this year about Parshat Chayei Sarah, that the way that after her death is announced, she's described as having lived to the age of 7 and 20 and 100 instead of 127 years old. And I'll spare you the rehash of that Devar Torah, but one of the comments, of course, Rashi says, at the age of 100, Sarah was still as pure of a soul as the age of 20, and at the age of 20, she was still as beautiful and innocent as a child of 7, and so on. In our Parsha, the Parsha itself, the Torah portion itself, begins in a very similar way. We have that verse, Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim shva esrei shana, Vayechi yemei Yaakov shnei chayav sheva shanim v'arba'im uma'at shana. And I heard this similar repetition to that first verse in Chayei Sarah. But the nuance is the beginning. It says, Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim shva esrei shana, that Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. That verb, Vayechi, you hear that parallel to Chayei Sarah. You see that word shana repeated again and again. And then it hit me. What is the significance of this 17 years? What does that matter? It can't possibly be that this is just a statement of time. 17 years passed, and let me tell you about the end of Jacob's life. Because the Torah, as I've often said, is a laconic text. Every word is there for a reason. There is nothing missing, and there is nothing extra. And so if it intentionally says 17 years, then it's to teach us something. And if we roll the tape back to the beginning of Parshat Vayeshev, Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz migorei aviv be'eretz Canaan, right? We just had Jacob spent 17 years in Egypt, and we roll the tape back to the beginning of Vayeshev. Jacob was dwelling in the land of his forefathers in the land of Canaan. Eilet Todot Yaakov, these are the generations of Jacob. Yosef ben Shva Esrei Shana Haya Roet Achav Bitzon. So Joseph was 17 years old, etc., etc., etc. We don't know anything from the Torah explicitly about Joseph's first 17 years of life, other than he lived under the care of his father. And from our parsha, we learn that Jacob lived his final 17 years under the care of his son. Without the Torah explicitly saying it, but just raising a red flag of the number of 17, we see two chapters that are basically explained away as ellipses, and yet the Torah points directly at them. The Dat Zakenim, a commentary, it's a collection of all the Tosfot on the Torah, suggests, and I like this, suggests that Jacob was being repaid spiritually and divinely for the affection and nurturing he provided Joseph. That is, Jacob took care of Joseph for 17 years, then he effectively sent him off to be sold into slavery and then become a vice pharaoh in Egypt. And then he's repaid for those 17 years with the 17 years of care at the end of his life. What it always makes me think of is any time that I or my brother have found ourselves in trouble or needing help from our parents in some way, my father always says, remember it when I'm older. right? This idea of Jacob caring for his son, and we could ignore the favoritism for a moment. Jacob caring for his son, and Joseph, you saw the image of him throwing himself on his father's face at the end of our parasha. But once you know, thank God for the numbers, there's actually something even deeper. There's something much deeper here. Rabbi Bachya tells us to go back to Chayei Sarah again. Those first words, Vayu Chayei Sarah, and these were I like to translate as the lives of Sarah, not the life of Sarah. It's almost saying that the Chayei Sarah were Vayu. Now you might say, but doesn't that just mean were? Or Rabbi Bachya says, no, Vav, Yud, Hey, Yud, Vav, it's a palindrome unto itself. It suggests you even stare at it, you can see bookmarks. And Rabbi Bachya says, and get the gematria. And the gematria, the Hebrew numerology of this word, Vayu, is 37. There were 37 years during which Sarah was able to practice motherhood. The last 37 years of her life, having given birth to Yitzchak when she was 90 years old. And so on one hand, the Torah records her as being 127, and that's the second part of the verse, mentions the 127 years. But she lived 127 not from her point of view, as Rabbeinu Bachya teaches us, but from an historian's point of view. If someone were to describe you and your age in your obituary, then they might say deceased at the age of. But if you're going to describe yourself, you might refer to different chapters. You might refer to different ages. And we find something similar in our parsha. We begin with this word, Vayechi. It's not the same as Vayu. It sounds similar, but it's not the same. And Rabbeinu Bachya says, no, what's the gematria of Vayechi? 34. That is a combination of the 17 years that Jacob enjoyed Joseph's company after he had been born, and the last 17 years of Jacob's life when he again enjoyed Joseph's company. These 34 years were the only truly happy ones that Jacob experienced. Because remember, Jacob lived a life of struggle and pain from the moment he was born. He was living on the lam, and then finally, when he got to marry his beloved and she gave birth, she died in childbirth. And Joseph was a bit of that redemption. She died giving birth to Benjamin. Joseph was that redemption. It's what he clung on to. And then Joseph is gone, and his life falls apart. But then it gets restored. 17 and 17 is his Vayechi. The way we measure time is not at all by our age. Even if we tell our kids, act your age, not your shoe size, right? You're old enough to do this, that, and that. But we don't measure time by our age. I love how many people say to me, well, I'm a young 60, or, I'm an old 50. I'm a young 90. We don't act our age. We talk about measuring our years in different ways. And we were reminded this week, the way the parsha begins, we measure in chapters. In fact, you'll recall if you were here when we started reading the Torah, that it's a struggle to find the beginning of the parsha. It starts in the middle of a line, no spacing. It's called a satuma. It is closed. And indeed, with this parsha, one book closes, one chapter closes. We have the death of Avot. Egypt gets a new pharaoh eventually next week who knew not Joseph. And one chapter closes, another opens and begins. And we're about to close out 2021. Yet another way to mark time. And for some, That is the marking of a chapter 2. T-O-O. Looking ahead into 2022. Hopefully this year will be different. Hopefully this year will be that trajectory up that I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. But you have to ask yourself, thinking about Sarah, thinking about Jacob, what chapter are you in right now? Ask yourself, how do you measure your years? Is it before and after children? During an illness? Overcoming an illness? Living in one city versus another? In fact, I was just having a conversation with someone the other day who shared with me that they're not from Minneapolis, that they're actually from New York. And I said, how long have you lived in Minneapolis? They said 42 years. How do we measure our chapters? Is it about one profession versus another? One relationship or another? There was a great show this week on PBS about the Beatles' White Album. And that chapter for the Beatles. What is your chapter? But most important, as we think about this parasha and the death of Jacob and Joseph, the real question we should leave Shul pondering this morning is, what role do we play in someone else's chapter? Those 17 years, those 37 years. What role do we play in someone else's chapter? Are we the closer or are we the opener? Or are we simply just a bystander and an extra? Because our role in life is to understand what is the weight of our mission and the value of our journey. How do we leave the world in a better place than we found it? And how do we navigate that by interfacing with everyone around us, not locking ourselves in a cave saying, I'm alone. Because bringing it back to the beginning, if someone is going to tell our story, they're going to discuss your age, your years. We have to ask the question as we close out this year in our calendar, how will someone recount our life? What is going to be the table of contents? What is going to be the delimiting factor and the indicator? Because we're about to start Israel's journey into oppression and slavery. And we gloss over those hundreds and hundreds of years real darn quick. So are you entering a year of oppression? Or are you entering a year of freedom? Are you entering a year where you heal others? Or are you entering a year where you need healing? And most important, how can you be the best sense of yourself to improve others? Shabbat Shalom.